Coming up on this episode of DevelopSec Live, we discussed coding standards and guidelines, take a look at an old Jenkins update, Tesla's cloud issue, and FedEx's data exposure. Tackling the challenge to integrate security into the development process? Looking for insights, answers, and practical solutions to avoid getting overwhelmed? Welcome to DevelopSec Live, where our focus is your success in securing and improving development processes. And here is your host, James Jardine.
Hey everyone, today I want to talk a little bit about standards, guidelines, how we deal with them within our organization so that way we can have better, secure development processes, but maybe at the same time not bringing them up specifically or calling them out specifically as secure processes. So I think most organizations have some form of coding guidelines, coding standards. Hopefully you've got something like this. And they typically cover things like, hey, this is how we want you to format your code. If you're using logic statements, this is how it should be. We want semicolons in certain spots, or we don't want semicolons in certain spots. A good example oftentimes is, if statements. If it's a single if statement, do we want to require that it's in code block with the curly braces surrounding it, or are we okay just to do the one indentation because it's one line? So we have a lot of different standards and we have coding guidelines that help us make sure that as we're developing applications, we're developing these applications kind of the same way. So it doesn't matter which developer comes in and starts working on the code, they're doing things in a similar fashion, and it's helping us reduce certain types of flaws that may exist in our code. Whether you're purposely setting stuff to null after you're done using it, whether you're calling dispose in a .NET world, all these things are used to help make sure that we follow certain processes when we build our applications. Unfortunately, what we find is a lot of these coding standards and these guidelines don't necessarily cover a lot of the security specific type things that us in the AppSec world want to be covered. So we see our own coding guidelines, our own policies and standards being put together to be pushed down upon the development groups and hope that they are adopted. Now, oftentimes when I see these, they're very vague. I know a lot of standards that I see out there, it's just called an application security standard. And you see things like thou shalt not include SQL injection in your application, or other items where you're thinking, okay, you must have peer review done on certain types of code, or certain applications require this type of scanning or testing to be performed before it's released out to production. All these things are great. We want to make sure that we're including these things because, again, it's these policies and standards that help make sure that we're doing something in a uniform way and we're doing it across the board, across all of our applications. But oftentimes, I feel like some of the limitations that we have when we talk about secure coding guidelines and policies is that we never keep them with the actual coding guidelines and policies that we currently may have in our organization. It also can highlight that we don't maybe have coding guidelines within our organization. But I've been in a lot of places where we have, our security portals, and that's where you go to get the information security policies and the information security guidelines that are out there. Well, this creates friction when we think about, okay, I need to go out as a developer, I have my coding guidelines, I know this is the style that I use, this is what we're going to be doing, this for this language are the rules I have to follow to make sure I'm keeping up with what the organization is looking for. Oh, and then I have to go out to this security portal, and there's a whole other set of rules that I need to follow to be able to bring this in and define this. And a lot of times this can be, a lot of hassle to go out and do, right? If I got multiple places that I have to go through and do things, chances are I'm not going to do them as often as I should be. So this can create somewhat of a problem. Now, of course, having them separate does help at least lay out and say specific, hey, here are our secure coding guidelines. This is what we should be doing. And oftentimes the secure coding guidelines are a bit vague. As I mentioned, thou shalt not have SQL injection, thou shalt, provide peer code review, flaws must be tracked within a bug tracking system. These are good things to say, hey, at least we're covering this, we know we're doing it. But oftentimes it's pretty high level. And if we think about it, it doesn't really provide solid information on what we should be doing. It's just a generic, you should do this. You shouldn't have SQL injection. Well, that doesn't provide a whole lot of standard as far as, well, how should I not do that within my organization? How do I stop that from happening in my application? And we have applications today in organizations that are written in multiple languages. Different groups use different languages when they're writing their applications. How do you keep that all under control? Now, some places will have central architecture groups. They define a lot of this. So they're defining how you should be accessing SQL, how you should be doing certain things. Do you use stored procedures? Do you not use stored procedures? Do you have custom libraries that are used across the board for things like logging, that type of stuff? A lot of places don't have architecture groups, so sometimes that's not as easy. But if we've already got these policies in place, how do we then transpose our stuff from our security policies to get them built into our regular policies and our regular standards? I feel like a lot of times we have a lot of friction when we talk about AppSec and we talk about development because we try so hard to create everything as our own. As in our own, I mean, it's got to be security focused. And so you see, we had an SDLC, now we have a secure SDLC or an SDL, right? The secure development lifecycle, because we couldn't just have the SDLC. And so we have coding guidelines. Now we have secure coding guidelines. You see it out there. We talk about DevOps, and now you see secure DevOps. We have to throw secure into everything, and then we want to own everything to make it ours. And it's great that we want to put forth that effort and we want to say, look, this is a problem and we want to help solve this problem. But we also want to look at what's the best ways to do this. And from what I've seen, creating everything separate still hasn't got the grasp that we're really looking for. Because I don't know about you, but I'm not that keen on having somebody else from a different department come in and start throwing down all these rules and all these guidelines of how I should be developing my applications. I want to be able to develop my applications, and I want to be able to have that creativity. I want to be able to build these things to the way that we think they need to be built. But at the same time, I do want to make sure that I'm building it with security in the process. I want to make sure that my applications have secure code, they're being security tested, right? That it's quality application for our users and for our organization. But to do that, oftentimes it's easier if I can put that all into one spot. So when we think about our coding guidelines, to be able to translate some of the security guidelines that we see coming out into just normal coding. How does a developer look at this? Instead of throwing a bunch of different terminology out there, use SQL injection, cross-site scripting, XML external entities, deserialization issues. We've got all these different flaws. And then you take those flaws and then you've got, renditions of those flaws. So, there's blind SQL injection, there's SQL injection, there's cross-site scripting with 3 different flavors. So how do we go about trying to get all this information and cram it over as, hey, here's all this new stuff that you have to know when you're developing your application? What if we're translating that into what their typical coding guidelines and coding standards would look like? So instead of saying, hey, you have SQL injection, you need to make sure you don't have that, and you need to run parameterized queries. That's a pretty simple statement. It's kind of vague depending on the application that you're dealing with. But turn that from a security violation just into a normal coding violation. Hopefully, we have coding guidelines already that talk to us about how do we access SQL Server, for example. This is how you're going to do this. When you're dealing with SQL, we want you to use parameterized queries, or we want you to use stored procedures, and this is the mechanism that we use those within our organization. And of course, all organizations are different. I've come across organizations that allow the use of store procedures, some that don't. They want inline queries, so to say. But if you're parameterizing those, that's fine, right? But figuring out how do you want to provide access to SQL Server and what are the rules for accessing that? We probably already have guidelines around SQL Server. So to take out a few of those rules, namely parameterized queries, least privilege, a few of those things, and shove them into their own document someplace else is doing a disservice in effect, because I'm getting some of them if I'm looking at my normal coding guidelines. And then hopefully I'm going out and looking at my secure coding guidelines to make sure I'm following those rules. And I'm hoping that because they're two different documents, that they're not actually stepping on each other or one saying something different than the other. If we have them all in one document, at least now we know that it should be quite apparent that, hey, wait a minute, these two things conflict with each other. We can't say both of these. Let's clear this up. So, but we're changing that into a coding violation rather than a security violation. And I know a lot of people, they prefer things that are occurring within their own environment, right? Within their own chain of command, so that, hey, this is a violation of our coding standards. We need to resolve this. Now, these coding standards may contain different risk levels than previous coding standards. If you're not, using the proper syntax as far as if statements as I used before, and you don't put the curly braces, but you got a single statement if, okay, yes, there could be an issue there, but it carries a much different risk level, typically, than something like a SQL injection flaw, depending on where it is. So these security flaws do have different risk levels, but that's part of triaging bugs and flaws in our systems and identifying a criticality to them. Is this critical? Is this high? Is this low? We do that for bugs anyway to make sure that we know what risk we have within the application. Now, that also brings us to storing these bugs in the same system as our bug tracking system. I've seen so many places try to store security bugs separately. So I've got to go to one system to be able to deal with my security bugs, and I go to another system to deal with the regular bugs the QA is finding, because for some reason we have to have these separated. I always push for people, store them all in the same spot. If you need a separate indicator, and I understand needing that separate indicator to be able to separate out and pull reports on security, because we have to report on security separately, I get that. Then have flags to be able to do that. That's fine. But storing it all in one spot, right, it removes that hassle. Same thing with putting it all in the same coding guidelines. It removes that hassle. So we want to put them together, and we want to make sure that we're covering the topics in a coding standard way versus a security way. Another example, talk about cross-site scripting. A lot of times you see things where it just says, oh, well, you should output and code. Okay, that's great, but output and coding is a perfect coding standard. It doesn't have to be a secure coding standard. So if we move from the secure coding standard side over to just the coding standard side and say when we're dealing with sending output to the web browser, then we can put in there, hey, one of the requirements for sending output is that we must be properly encoding that data as it comes down. And so when our scanners run and they identify that, hey, we have cross-site scripting, really what we're saying is you have violated a coding policy that you didn't properly output and code your data before it went down to that process, right, to the browser. Take XML external entity as another example. One of the ways that we solve this issue in some systems, especially Microsoft.NET, is being able to properly set up the XML parser to make sure that it's not going to process external DTDs. Well, if you have in your coding standards dealing with XML processing, there may be other items in there that aren't security related, but now we also have security related items inside there saying, hey, make sure that your process is set up like this. If you're using the XML reader, it should be set up like this. If you're using an XML document, this is how we set it up. We've set these standards, and it's all within the same piece of document that I don't have to go to multiple places trying to find it. Now, you might have multiple documents spread out, but again, none being specifically security specific necessarily, but topic specific. So the XML example was, hey, we could have an XML standard So when we're dealing with XML, these are the things we do, and it ties off of the main coding standard, but it covers everything XML related, security or not. So it's all in one spot. So I know, hey, when I'm going to deal with XML, let me go look at the XML standard. If I'm going to look at SQL, then I want to go look at the SQL standard. So these are easy ways to be able to build this in. We're actually embedding it. We talk about embedding security all the time. This is embedding security into the processes that we're currently doing. Is we're saying we're going to take what we currently have and we're actually going to embed our security. We're going to infuse it into our current systems. So let's take a quick look, because I looked at this real quick. There's actually Drupal. I found their documentation kind of interesting. And what they have is they have a whole bunch of security coding standards that exist out there. If you go out to Drupal.org, I'm not here to debate Drupal security, but I like what I saw when I looked at this, because you've got at the top, you've got a coding standard that's up here, but also you've got all these other standards that they have split out. So just like I was saying, so if you want to look at how do I deal with SQL coding conventions, you go down the navigation list on the right, you click on SQL coding conventions, and then we've got a whole bunch of things. Now, these are typical things we see in coding standards, right? Don't use reserved words. How do we capitalize data? Different ways that we deal with those systems. But if we scroll down a little bit, we can actually see that while nothing jumps out and says security, the fourth statement down here under capitalize and user supplied data is actually highlighting, saying variable arguments should be moved out of the query body and passed in separate parameters. And then it at the bottom says this ensures that the data will be properly escaped and prevents SQL injection attacks. They also have another statement right below it. Preventing SQL injection is easy. DB query provides a way to use parameterized queries. So we've got a whole bunch of things talking about dealing with SQL, and then embedded in that, we have items talking about SQL injection, which of course is a security feature or a security flaw that we're trying to protect against. And so they've got this broken down quite nicely. And like I said, I like how this is broken down where it's embedding that stuff in. Now, I do see a lot of sites now, a lot of languages have put out security guidelines that are separate. And that's great. They're kind of not really one pagers, one web pagers, not just one 8 by 11 page, but we have different systems that have these things broken out that say, look, if you know the language, here we got a set of security guides that help push you in the right direction so that you're going to specifically call out security. And that is one of the things that we get by having security guidelines separate or security coding separate, is it raises that awareness. It calls it out and says, hey, I've got something you must look at. We need to do this. But to me, that should be pulled from the main pieces that we have. If you've got coding guidelines, if you want to have a separate secure coding guideline, that should pull from your coding guidelines. So that way you make sure I've got a document. I've got everything in my document, whether it's coding guidelines, whether it's the SDLC. I've got an SDLC, and in that SDLC, I've got bullet points for how do I handle security vulnerabilities. But then if you want to pull out something as kind of a quick cheat sheet, a note sheet, pull it out. You've got it in a second document. Of course, this adds maintenance to it. But at least that's a subset of what already exists in the main thing. So that way you can still call out what you have, but it still exists in that main piece. Now, of course, this requires working with the custodians of the main piece, making sure that do you already have coding guidelines in place, coding standards in place. Let's take a look at those. All right, what are we missing from these to where we can protect against certain things? You have a piece in here about SQL. I don't see anything about parameterized queries. How can we update these coding standards to make sure that we're all doing this the same way and we're protecting against SQL injection? I see we don't have anything that talks about sending data down to the web. This wouldn't cover cross-site scripting. So can we add a piece that talks about transferring data from server to client? How do we properly do that? And one of the items that we're going to have in there is going to relate to output encoding to help protect us, to make sure that we are output encoding that data to protect ourselves from cross-site scripting. So these are the types of things that as we put this together, it should help build up what we have. It's going to be more specific to what we're doing as an organization. So that way you don't, how many times do you go out and have somebody fix cross-site scripting, but it's just because you found the flaw, you assign it to somebody, they go fix it, and then the next time we see it, somebody else might get assigned, they might not fix it the same way. When we put that all into our standards and our guidelines, then they know how to approach these items, and we're going to approach it and resolve it the same way every time. We know that everybody understands the guidelines. We know they understand the standards. So when we start building a new app, they know what they're supposed to be doing, and they're building that stuff in, so that way not only do they have expectations of how to code, but they also have expectations of what type of processes are going to come later. Whether that is, hey, you're required to go through code review for certain items. You're required to have testing on certain things. Do it like a food menu, and you get at the restaurant, they got asterisks next to certain things, with a side note that says, hey, these certain things must be tested by these approved tools within the organization or this group. And, we have bug bars that are set that anything higher than a high or anything higher than a medium must be remediated before it actually goes live. You can still have those rule sets built into there. But what we're pushing for is, why don't we try to put all those into the same bucket, so that way we know what plan we have. We're not searching a whole bunch of different documents just to find the same thing. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, when you look at typical secure coding guidelines or secure coding documents, they kind of cover everything. They're not broken down. And so that makes it really difficult when we looked at that Drupal piece. Right, I say, oh, I'm dealing with SQL. Let me go to SQL. I get everything SQL. Right now, I might get some SQL here. I might go into the information security policy. I get some SQL there. I get the application security standard. I get some SQL there. I get this other piece. I get some SQL over here. Right, they're all over the place. It's everywhere. That's opening up our chance for missing something and being vulnerable. It adds confusion to what we're doing. So if you've got thoughts or anything like that on when you're talking about these guidelines, coding standards, I'd love to hear your what you guys are doing out there, whether you have regular coding standards already in place. Do you have secure coding standards? Is anybody combining these together to see how they work as one, instead of having two separate documents in two different places, and what type of results they're seeing from that? Because I can see it being much better results. Coming from a development background, I don't want a whole bunch of places I have to go find stuff. And when I put things in terminology that I'm fully aware of, that I'm dealing with all the time, then that's where I'm going to get the most bang for my buck, so to say, when I'm dealing with implementing security into my stuff. Because basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to lay the foundation for security to be present without security really being a forefront. Right? It is a forefront. It's something that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to, but it's going to turn into something that I'm doing it just because that's what our standards say. This is how I do it. Not I'm doing it because security says I need to do it. It's because this is the way it should be done. And that's how we should be doing things. It's not because one certain group says, hey, you should be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. It's just the way it should be done. And the more we can build this into the current systems, the more it feels like this is just the way, rather than this is something special outside the realm. So share your thoughts with me. Reach out, james@developsec.com, or hit me up at DevelopSec on Twitter, or you can hit me at Jardine Software on Twitter as well. And share any ideas that you have, any stories that you have, the hurdles that you have. We want to help try to get past some of these. So if you've got any of those, reach out. I'd love to try to help you, get a handle on some of that. So thanks for listening to this episode of this. And if you're on the live version right now, then stay tuned for the newscast coming up right after that.